Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Alexis Dudden. Alexis is a professor of history at the University of Connecticut, and she focuses her research on the strained relationships between Japan and Korea. Her first book ran through a deep history of Japan's colonization of Korea. Her second, and the one that we're going to be speaking about today, talks about this history and just how it affects the present, how it narrows in on modern Korea and modern Japan. This book is titled Troubled Apologies Among Japan, Korea and the United States. In large part, we're going to be focused on the first chapter of this book, though this theme does run deeper into it. The issue in question here are two small islands situated almost directly in the middle of Korea and Japan. Dokdo is the Korean name, Takeshima is the Japanese name. And more than anything else, these islands have become the focus for the modern disputes between Japan and Korea, the modern nationalism on each side, and just how they interact. Now, Japan annexed these islands in 1904 and 1905, just on the eve of their deeper colonization of the Korean peninsula itself. They remained a part of Japanese territory all the way up until 1945. When Japan fell, its empire fell as well. But of course, Japan is a nation of islands. So when redrawing what modern Japan would be, it wasn't as easy as simply following natural geographic designs and pushing the country back together. There was always going to be some issue of which island was the last Japanese one, which island was the first Korean, the first Chinese, the first Russian. And there was always going to be friction along these borders. In 1951, the San Francisco Treaty was the definitive document on this. It was drawn up to put a final statement upon the end of Japanese colonization and the future nature of the Japanese state. The idea was simple. It was to return all former colonial lands back to their original owners. However, Dokdo or Takeshima was left out of this document. And because it wasn't mentioned, the Japanese legal claim to the island suddenly exploded into life. This was now legally, by definition, Japanese land. The South Koreans on the other side claimed that Japan had simply manipulated themselves into this situation. They had lobbied America, they had lobbied the great powers, and now they had claimed this island that was never theirs. Koreans look back and claim that they've had it for 1500 years. Their old maps dating back to the Three Kingdoms and other historical documents that show Japan recognizing the island as being Korean. And to push back on the claim of the San Francisco document, Koreans say that the intention was clear. It was a mistake not to return this island and not a design. Now, the role that America play in all of this becomes very, very important. And Alexis does a great job of just showing how this dispute has been American interests and how the Dokdo-Takeshima dispute was designed by Americans themselves, at least in some degree. Now, to look inwards upon this dispute is a very strange thing to do. People are burning themselves alive in streets, mutilating themselves, killing live animals in front of embassies. This is an issue that is incredibly visceral inside both countries. In 2004, when a small Japanese boat decked itself out in the national flag and headed towards the island, Seoul responded by threatening a full military response if the boat continued on its path. Again, in 2006, when small private Japanese boats were heading towards the island, then South Korean President Roh Moo-hyun claimed that Japan had learned nothing from its imperial past, and it was once again seeking to dominate the region. So why the animosity over two largely uninhabitable islands without any discernible natural resources worth fighting over? Well, as Alexis Dudden will show, it is history and modern national identity. For Korea, Dokdo is the embodiment of historical war crime. It is now the issue for which South Korea will assert themselves and try and claim reparation, try and claim apology, and try to properly reassert themselves. For Japan, this is just an apology game. They see politicians and people ginning up the issue simply for the benefits of their own national identity, to try and make a permanent scapegoat out of the modern Japanese nation, which of course is now well separated from its war criminal past. Now, of course, I've glossed over that incredibly briefly there, and there is so much more to it, so much more nuance, so much more detail, so much more difficulty, and I'll let Alexis Dudden extrapolate this for us. Now, before we get started, I have to do a very small piece of housekeeping. Because of some technical difficulties, we had to conduct this interview by a phone, so the sound quality is not quite where you would hope it to be, and in some places it's slightly inconsistent. And on a personal note, I'm suffering from a particularly nasty cold at the moment, and in the first couple of minutes of this interview it caught up with me at just the wrong time. So if you can hear some background coughing during the first question, then I deeply apologize for that. I assure you that it doesn't continue throughout the interview. I do get a hold of myself, and I'm now heavily medicated, and by the next interview this won't be a problem. Now, as always, if you enjoyed the podcast and you consider it to be in any way valuable, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached to this podcast, www.patreon.com patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. And so, without any further delay, this is Alexis Dudden. Alexis Dudden, welcome to the Create Our Podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So today we're going to be speaking about Dokdo, or Takeshima, these islands off the coast of, I suppose, Japan and Korea. So just to give the audience a sort of flag post here of where we are, where are these islands and how big are they, how many are there, what is the general scene we're looking about here?
Excellent question, because for a long time they weren't even called islands, they were just sort of rocks. And it's actually kind of important to add the French word, Liancourt, because the United States Central Intelligence Agency, as well as the rest of the American government, refers to these rocks on official maps as the Liancourt Rocks, which names them after an 1849 French whaling ship, which almost crashed and caused devastation to the whalers aboard. And I say that because they are, for most of their human history, not a great place to live. So when we think about what an island is, unless you are stationed there as part of the Korea Maritime Police, it's a very difficult place to live. So we're talking about two volcanic steep rocks in the middle of the ocean between Japan and Korea that are relatively recent geologically, about 4 million years old, and they jut straight up out of the sea. They're absolutely gorgeous. It's very difficult to sustain any sort of life there other than a few kinds of flowers. Birds like to nest there, and sea lions used to gather there, which is why during the Japanese Empire, a man from the sort of southwestern northern coast of Japan, the Shimane Prefecture area, named Nakai Yozaburo, had a sea lion butchery built on them. And so it's a place that fishermen in the region have long known about. The squid is fantastic around it. Octopus is pretty good. But it's, these are difficult places to inhabit as a human being. So I've had the pleasure of spending a night on one of them. There are two of these rocks that jut out from the sea, and the South Korean government has established a maritime police station on one of them, and on the other one, an octopus fisherman and his wife live and have a sort of they live on a floor of an apartment building, essentially a very low one, 4 stories, that is run by the adjacent prefecture on the coast. And if you are invited as a guest of the South Korean government, you can spend a night. It's the only time in my life that I have truly felt that I was in an uninhabitable space. And I say that sort of, you wake up in the morning and you think, oh my God, how do I get out of here? It's not a place fit for human habitation. It's a place that is for fishing. It's a place that is for positioning as a navigator, and a place for radar stations. And that's where this really takes on an interesting question for the 21st century, because the word island, and I don't mean to go on so long, but the word island suggests a place of refuge or intrigue, or somewhere you could land on and live. But this is a place to cling to. These are not easily inhabitable. So this is more now a marker in the sea. There are 2 ways to think about that. These are at once markers for resource exploitation and defense strategies, security strategies. But for both Japan and Korea, these have become nodal points to mark different opposing nationalist claims. And so it's a really beautiful spot on the planet, but they've taken on a really outsized space given their actual presence on the globe.
So to walk into those nationalistic claims, just to build the scene out a little bit more here, you begin your book with this discussion in 2004, and you talk about it was meant to be the year of friendship between Japan and South Korea, And then this very small boat from Japan sets sail towards these islands. And I might get you to tell us of just about that incident of this boat and what it meant to Japan and what it meant to Korea, and just to help us sort of build the scene of just how much animus and just how tense this situation is.
Great, because this is about 15 years ago almost, and most Japanese, to the great distress of the Japanese government, could not possibly have told you where Takeshima was. And yet a small, what we would call a sort of radical fringe group, set sail in a very small motorboat covered with right-wing rising sun flags and banners and claims. But the Japanese Coast Guard turned them back at the ocean border because this is not a place that Japanese can go by water. Japanese are allowed to travel there, yet they have to fly to Incheon in Seoul, or they can fly to Korea, and then like any other tourist, they have to, or non-scuba diver or whatever, they have to go there via ferry and hydrofoil, and so you get there via various passes. Several Japanese politicians, particularly right-wing politicians, have been rejected from their final application when they're halfway there, because the South Korean government knows that they're probably going to try to plant a Japanese flag on them or something ridiculous like that. But in 2004, when this group asserted its claim, it was revealing an impulse in one group of Japanese society that had not taken issues quite that far vis-a-vis claims for this rock for quite some time. The South Koreans then countered back and forth, and that really began the current vicious cycle over these rocks. I mean, when in the San Francisco Treaty in 1951-52, the United States decided not to name this territory, there had been much discussion in various drafts, documents, including the inclusion, the exclusion of naming this territory in the draft, in the final treaty. But then ultimately, in September 1951, when the San Francisco Treaty was signed, this particular island was absent. And that's noticeable because there had been active lobbying, active discussion, active inclusion of this prior to the final draft. When the treaty went into effect, the then president of South Korea took advantage of the moment, stationed troops on the territory. Equally important to bear in mind, if not most important to bear in mind, was that Korea was at war. And so the who owned these rocks question, the United States intentionally left absent in the event that the northern side, the North Koreans, won the war. The United States wanted to make sure it could claim the territory for itself. So in many respects, in 1952, this wasn't a question for the United States about whether it would be Korean or Japanese territory. It was going to be under U.S. jurisdiction, which is arguably where it remains today.
And for people listening, they may have these conjuring images up of islands like the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which is a dispute between Japan and China, and of course a dispute up in the with Japan and Russia over a couple of islands up in the north, which I guess technically means the Second World War is still ongoing. But you mentioned in your book that at least some of these disputes, or at least around Senkaku Islands, are at least about the natural resources involved in them. But though they are important for the Dokdo Takeshima Islands, it is a lot more. It's just really about history. It's not really about the natural gas, or if any is ever found, or any natural resources. It's just about the history of the moment.
You're completely correct, and that actually holds true for each of the islands that is contested by Japan today. So if we step back for a minute, in the current security climate, when we have a real situation in Northeast Asia in which the future of the region's peace and possibility is in the crosshairs. And for many people, Japan is the stable actor in the region, the sort of diligent partner, reliable ally, progressive, open society. And yet, noticeably, Japan has the most unstable international borders because of the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea. Archipelagic nations now have borders that are entirely in the water. Each of Japan's water borderlines is up for grabs because Japan contests sovereignty over these island markers, which delineate where Japan starts and stops as a sovereign territory. So I'm really glad that you introduced the other two claims that Japan makes, because this circles us again back to the San Francisco Treaty, architected by the United States but signed by 48 nations, and the Allied Treaty of Peace with Japan. But it's a negative in the definition of Japanese territory. You find a negative definition, what Japan is not. Japan is not Korea and certain islands. Japan is not what we now call Taiwan, but in the treaty was called Formosa and adjacent islands. Japan is not part of these Russian-claimed islands. And so then, okay, what is the United States doing at the time? The United States is setting up the architecture for a Cold War perimeter in which the United States would be able to base U.S. troops on Japanese soil in perpetuity, and these various littoral spots, the islands, Littoral, littoral, I mean, the sort of the offshore or shoreline areas were where the United States was going to either create bases, as in the Ryukyu island chain, particularly Okinawa, and or what about this island that was between Japan and Korea? So the Russian one is tricky because at the Yalta Conference in early 1945, Roosevelt promised the Kuriles to Stalin should Russia decide to scrap its neutrality pact against Japan and enter the war, which Russia did. Soviet forces entered the war, swarming into Manchuria, what is now North Korea, the northern areas of Japanese-controlled Sakhalin, and these northern island areas. So that's a really sort of traumatic history in which Japanese, almost 20,000 Japanese colonists were on the islands that Japan claims from Russia today. Noticeably, however, an island Japan does not claim is the southern half of Sakhalin, what Japanese used to call Karafuto, where 400,000 Japanese colonists lived until the Russians captured them in 1945 and sent them to their gulags, where they would be POWs in some of the most egregious conditions of the post-war era. So there's a host of stuff going on in that dispute, and then the rock disputed between the rock that Japan claims is its own, and Korea maintains there is no dispute because this is Korean territory, was something that was vaguely on the radar. The United States government put it under U.S. Control initially. Then the man named William Siebold, who was the political desk officer for MacArthur under the occupation in Tokyo, lobbied on behalf of Japanese interests because he was very close to a number of Japanese politicians. So in that particular claim, there's something really different going on because MacArthur in 1949 gave an interview in which he made clear what American interests were, which Boone Atchison would then give a very famous speech in January 1950 called the Atchison Perimeter Speech for History, that stems U.S. claims from the Philippines up to the Aleutian Islands, that arcs back from Philippines, Taiwan, onto Okinawa, onto Japan proper, and up to the Aleutians, that avoids mention of anything to do with Korea. And so at that point, William Siebold begins to lobby hard for Japanese interests, which are as many islands that Korea was claiming as Korean as they could. So what's noticeable is not simply the the Dokdo Takeshima issue, but that at the time Japan was also asking for Ulumdo, Jeju-do, islands that it did not get ultimately in the San Francisco Treaty. The San Francisco Treaty noticeably had mention of what the Japanese called Takeshima in a variety of drafts. Famously in 1951, Dean Rust mentioned in a famous note that maybe the United States would consider granting Japan control of Takeshima, but that simply mirrored this idea of acting on Japanese interests. So Koreans started to lobby hard that this was Korean territory, and they were playing each other's games. It's mine, it's yours, it's mine, it's yours. And then ultimately, which is the real kicker, and I'm sorry to go on so long.
No, that's fine.
But ultimately, the San Francisco Treaty leaves out mentioning this island at all, which, if you look at practically, it's a rock. It's an uninhabitable place. And so, okay, did the Allies just forget about it? But no, they didn't forget about it at all because they had mentioned it in numerous rough drafts. So then we have to look at what was going on in the summer and early fall of 1951, which was that the United States Air Force was using this rock as a place to dump unused ordnance. American Air Force pilots were dropping bombs that they had not dropped on North Korea during the war. They were lessening their payload so that they could land safely when they returned to the new base at Kadena in Okinawa, which Okinawa was the United States in 1951. It remained the United States territory until 1972. So we have this totally different architecture for what counted as whose territory was what at the time that the San Francisco Treaty comes into effect, which then brings us to the East China Sea. So, you know, if U.S. pilots are depositing unexploded ordnance on what is now called Dokdo, because they didn't want to risk their own lives by landing with bombs in Okinawa, then we have to look at who controlled Okinawa and what Okinawa claims. Okinawa claims control over what Japanese call Sankaku, what Chinese and Taiwanese refer to as Diaoyudai. And so, you know, whose rocks those are is a different dispute to get all together. And yet, that became part of the picture in 1972 when the United States reverted sovereign control of Okinawa to Japan. At the same juncture, the United States recognized that Taiwan had equal legal claim to the rocks in question today. Then you started this question, and I'm circling back to it again, apologies for the long-winded discussion, but you started this with the resource claim. And you're exactly right. So what resources are we talking about? We're talking about some oil and natural gas in the East China Sea. We're talking about the possibility of really exciting future energy ideas in the waters around Dokdo, deep sea vent, what we all call liquid fire ice, which is this deep sea kind of frozen fuel. And then around the Russian-controlled islands, an incredible amount not only of natural gas, but of rare earth minerals. So, yes, there are resources, and yet the way these islands are contested today reveals something else is at stake, because the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea allows for joint management of resources if nations agree to table sovereign claims. And since nations are not agreeing to table sovereign claims, nobody can develop the resources. And that's where the question of, as you rightly put it, this is about who's fighting over telling the history narrative. That comes into relief. And that's really what's going on is, for the Koreans, this is the first piece of Korea that Japan stole. And that's the way the narrative goes. For Japan, we're going to ignore the wars altogether. This has always and inherently been part of Japan. And it's a standoff that has no common dialogue by virtue of how each side wants to tell the history.
So let's walk into that side, at least. Let's touch on the Japanese claims first, the Japanese argument, and then we might move across to the Korean side and give this some broader context here. So, as you mentioned there, it was the first part of Korea that they stole. So I suppose it is in 1904 that we should start with this sea lion hunter that wants ownership over these islands. And then it moves forward to 1905 when they claim, I suppose, a much broader section of Korea itself. And then we come up to the San Francisco Declaration Treaty that you speak about, where the islands are given back and the territory claimed by Japan is given back, but Dokdo is excluded. So I suppose in some sense, at least legally, there's a claim the Japanese make that because we claimed it in 1905, 1904, and it wasn't returned in 1945, it's still technically ours in that sense. Is that effectively the heart of the Japanese claim to this?
It is, and Japan would actually even go further than that and start looking at leasehold claims that were initially made in the 1880s. But then we have to look at the issue of how private property claims were made in Japanese law. Prior to 1868 and the advent of the Meiji era, the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate, nobody owned land except for the Tokugawa shogun himself. And so the issue of having private control over an island was moot prior to this shift to a modern series of ways of claiming private land. And so in the 1880s, various Japanese began to request control in modern law over these rocks. Not only Dokdo, Takeshima, but also the Senkaku Diaoyudai. And this connects the two of them, which is why the Japanese government uses the Latin unclaimed territory, terra nullius, notion of what these islands were. And yet, looked at from the other perspective, Koreans were long fishing these islands. These islands had been part of Korean maps for a long time, as well as from the other perspective in Taiwan, there had been claims to what the Japanese would come to call the Senkaku from a Taiwanese perspective. And noticeably, the island, the Chinese character for Senkaku actually is a direct translation of the first British mapping of these islands as the Pinnacle Rocks. And so these islands did not have a name in Japanese before the British gave them a name. And so it's, the way fishermen used islands, the way human beings for the long array of history used the ocean and its resources was far different from the kind of private control and then ultimately today's national control over spaces that not only claim the rocks that we're talking about, but claim enormous spaces around them in the ocean for national control under the auspices of exclusive economic zone regimes, as well as extended continental shelf regimes. So when plucky, early modern Japanese fishermen and sea lion hunters claimed these various rocks for themselves, that was one thing. But what is absolutely clear is that without winning the wars that Japan won against China and then Russia, there would be no way that these individual entrepreneurs could have made private claim to these territories that people from the other nations also were using. And this is where the Japanese government's argument gets really, really illogical, because yes, there was until 2005, in particular reference to Dokdo Takeshima, the claim by the Japanese government that because the San Francisco Treaty does not say that the islands are not ours, they are ours. That sort of wonderful double negative equals a positive. And yet what's absent in that understanding and is absent in today's totally different policy that the Japanese government has put forward since 2014 is that no warfare was involved. I mean, the only way to get territory above water on this planet until very recently was through warfare or to purchase it. So you think of the Zionist movement, for example, a totally different example, but the Zionists purchased the land that today the world knows as Israel. And, that doesn't justify X, Y, or Z about it, but it was a land property transaction with money. So that's one way to get land, as many of us, have mortgages, buy houses, etc. But another way to get land, the more usual way to get land for a nation, is to have a war and claim your victory spoils. And that's how Dokdo became Takeshima for Japan, insofar as fishermen had used the rock for centuries, the same way they had used the rocks in the East China Sea for centuries. But winning the first war against China in 1895, winning the first war against what at the time was described in highly racialist terms as, wow, they beat a white power, winning that war granted Japan certain claims. And those claims included the rocks that are in dispute today. The Kuriles are a little different. The Russian territory is a little different because it involves an indigenous people, which is being erased by the Japanese government's claim today that they have always been Japanese, which couldn't be further from the truth. They had, we have records of 15,000-year-old whale bones, which were not anything to do with a place we call Japan today, but the Ainu people. And so this is where it gets it's what the Japanese government is doing since 2014 with its connection of these islands together into a single policy is to set Japanese history on a collision course with law, but also, maybe even more noticeably, is to erase the very Japanese history that made these contested places Japanese for a certain time and place, and then not Japanese for a certain time and place. Because as you mentioned, this guy, Nakayo Zaporo, a sea lion entrepreneur on Dokdo, made those islands Takeshima between 1905 and 1945, but then Japan lost not only Takeshima, but the entire vast space that was the Japanese Empire, which stretched from the Aleutian Islands down almost to Australia. And that's where the dispute today over these nodal points has far more to do with claiming historical narratives, historical consciousness, than actually what happened.
So, if the Japanese claim is rooted in, I suppose, a very strict legal definition of what happened and where it did, the Korean claim has a much deeper grasp on history. It tries to ignore the San Francisco Treaty in a sense and speak to a deep historical connection. They say the Dokdo has been part of Korea for 1,500 years, and that I suppose the 17 or 1600s, a certain Japanese document claims that it actually was Korean, and it's almost like a claim to look towards the spirit of the San Francisco document rather than the actual legal text. They say the idea was to return all conquered territory, and it was some sort of accident or some sort of deception by Japanese lobbying that left Dokdo out of this.
Right, and the problem is it was more likely American contingency planning and American shoring up benefit for itself. I'll put it this way. Yes, the Korean ancient claims are valid. Japan also could say, well, nobody was there when we were starting this new thing called modern law, and so we made claims. I live in the United States. I live in a state that was peopled by indigenous Mashantuckets and Pequots and Mohegans, and I live on their territory, but their people did not have legal documents to prove that this was their land. And I say that because the International Court actually doesn't want to see any ancient documents. They just want to kind of talk about the 20th century. What have you got? What have you got? Maybe 50s. But the International Court has been clear that ancient claims, they can't get into that. So then what do we have in the San Francisco Treaty? And this is where this particular island is really interesting to me as an American in particular, and why I feel I can actually have a position, because I think the United States government intentionally created this problem so that the United States would always have to be integral to solving it if it ever wanted to solve it. And I say that because not so much the 1946 first occupation map of the region, which is the first thing you can see on the internet. This island is included in the American control of Korea space. And that's because for all sorts of intents and purposes, geological reasons, historical reasons, reality reasons, Dokdo is connected to Ulleungdo. No matter what generation name you want to use, it is geologically of the same event, and there we have it. They are together in very much the same way that the Japanese islands, the Okishoto, which are the closest islands just a bit to the southeast, are Japanese, but they are related islands. And so the Americans initially penciled these islands into the sphere of Korea. But again, this is not something that people were considering as the major point of concern in 1945, 46, because people weren't living on them. And they'd been a place to make money as a fisherman, as a sea lion hunter, but not a place to feed your family or to establish a residence. So then we go through the U.S. occupation period for several years of Japan. That lasts till 1952, but we have to remember that the Korean War breaks out before that. And that's the most important thing going on. So there's a disjunct in American planning for what the area is going to look like, because MacArthur, as early as March 1949, starts talking about what the United States will protect in order to protect its interests, which for MacArthur was anything anti-communist. And for him to defend the western coast of the United States meant that he would create this perimeter, the Philippines arcing back across Japan's mainland up to the Aleutian Islands. But he was really clear, and then that became American policy in January 1950 when Dean Acheson gave this so-called perimeter speech and spelled it out. And probably every historian has argued that Acheson's non-inclusion of the word Korea invited Kim Il-sung to seek Soviet assistance to invade South Korea in June 1950. Was Dokdo at all important? No, it really, really wasn't in terms of the big picture of things. It was important in a very important small way as the war unfolded, again, with the American pilots using it as a place that they could just dump their, they knew it was there. It was a marker in the sea, and they could use it as target practice, which is the same thing the United States Air Force used the Senkaku for in Okinawa, and the United States still uses related. I mean, the Senkaku are a number of islands. It's not just one or two. There are about, 8 or 9 of them? Forgive me, I'm not exactly sure. But the United States military still uses some of those islands as target practice. And so that, there's several things going on. And the problem is today, these tiny spits of rock in the sea have become intense places of focal point for nationalist identity. And yes, for all historical purposes, this is the easternmost point of Korea. It's where the sun rises for the place that we call Korea. And yet, the United States in 1952, in 1951 and 52 in the San Francisco Treaty intentionally did not name this island. Why? Not because we didn't know about it, but because in 1951, the United States, Washington, could not be sure who was going to win the war in Korea, which had nothing to do with the war that had happened until 1945. It had nothing to do with the long array of Korean history or Japanese claims. It had to do with contingency planning in September 1951. And in September 1951, Washington could not be sure who was going to hold on to the place that we call Korea today. And so, yes, what's really interesting in the San Francisco Treaty territory section is how negatively defined the place we call Japan today is. Japan is not Korea. Japan is not Taiwan. Japan is not. But the way it's done in legal terms in the treaty is that Korea will resume independence. Japan will recognize, Japan renounces claims to Korea. But to whom? Because the United States couldn't be sure which side was going to win. Japan renounces claims to Formosa, what we now know as Taiwan, but it doesn't say to whom. To mainland China, to the Taiwanese. And so the real problem for the architects, the American architects of this treaty, was immediate. The language was, we lost China. We couldn't afford to lose Korea, but we weren't sure we were going to not lose Korea. So the way we did not entirely lose Korea was by not naming Dokdo. And that's where this is truly fascinating, because is Dokdo technically then a possession of the United States Congress? It might be in treaty law. For all intents and purposes, obviously it's Korean because it's Korean today. And possession is 9/10 of the law. But this is a really intentionally ambiguous space. The one with the former Soviet Union, the Russians, that dispute is a little less ambiguous because the United States does recognize Russian administrative control over the islands, but that's exactly the same terminology the United States uses for the Senkaku, in which it gives Japan administrative control. So when you look at today's CIA maps, today's U.S. Navy maps, the whole region is still fighting World War II. And that's where rather than who benefited, Japan or Korea, it's clear that this is a United States thing. We have remained in the picture because that was how we were not going to lose the war against communism.
So it's a fascinating sort of look into this problem that is the American side of it. But so just for a second here, I'm going to touch on something else you mentioned in the book. You talk about the islands and how important they are, and of course Japan will do these things like they have Takeshima Day, which sets off massive protests in Seoul where people cut off fingers. Once someone even burnt themselves alive, it's this huge, it causes a huge amount of turmoil across the border. But you mentioned at one point in the book that you say Japan may not fight over the islands, but they will fight over the sea, because the sea that the islands sit in, of course, is called the Sea of Japan now. And of course, now this becomes another huge form of dispute. And on that, you also make another very interesting claim, just down that same way, that people often don't quite give Japan the credit that they deserve in just how fearful this can be for them. That they looked at their country, which is a set of islands, as something that is a form of weakness. It's the reason that they failed. And that if they give away one island, if they surrender their claim to one island, then why not the next? Why not the next? The whole nation begins to crumble in on it. And you say, if Korea could recognize this, then maybe they can make more progress on other issues, such as comfort women and things like this.
Absolutely. And so there's a real give and take here, because, when the terrain has shifted a little bit, because in 2005, there was still much more of an atmosphere of reconciliation in the room, even with a sort of very nationalist prime minister in the form of Koizumi Junichiro. And yet his form of nationalism was not at the expense of engagement with surrounding countries. His form of nationalism was far more economic. And so we've shifted in the past 15 years to a nationalism that is more revanchist, territorially based, and one that is more precarious given Japanese historical legacies in the region. And so, there are plenty of reasons that we should call this the Sea of Japan. That's what the name is on international maps. That's the name that pilots use. And I really do think of this. I wish I could fly a plane. I can't fly a plane. But if you're flying a plane, you really want to know what the name of the water you're over is, which is, it's far less so as a sailor. You know you're on the water. And so in some respects, really doesn't matter what the water is called. But if you are a pilot, you need to know as a reference what you're over. So yes, there needs to be a name for this ocean. until Japan colonized Korea, what's really interesting that is to say, until 1905, 1910, this ocean name really didn't matter to anybody. And it's 50-50 on European maps, 17 and 1800s maps that are all in, the British Library, French museums, the grand, gorgeous early maps of sort of Europe at the time refer to it either as the Sea of Japan, Korean Sea, or a sea with no name. And I have examples of each of these. The name, the Sea of Japan, is actually what the Russians called it because the Russians were on their way to try to conquer Japan. And you think about the coastline, it's mostly Russia. Russia has the largest claim to this sea, but Russian population is not yet there. And so it's not a dispute for Russia yet. When it gets there, it might name it. Who knows? But it obviously had to have some sort of name for the indigenous people, but they didn't write it down. And then in 1928, when Japan is really feeling that it has become an international power, it is it's a member of the League of Nations. It is on the winning side of World War I, so it's part of all of these sort of liberalist world order treaty organizations, including the International Hydrography it's a difficult word to pronounce, Hydrographic Organization, and they designate the name of the sea. The problem was Japan had erased the country called Korea by that point by colonizing them. So Koreans could make absolutely zero claim to say, well, this has been called the East Sea throughout our nation's history. And, if you think about how the China world order named places, it's all north, south, east, west. And so that's why we even have still the East China Sea. But there is no Japanese name for this ocean until the 1780s when it's first written down. What's interesting is that the first name in Japanese for this ocean that's contested today is that it's called Japan's Inland Sea, and that the Japan Sea is what we now all call the Pacific Ocean. Flip it over, Japan's Inland Sea is now to the south coast of Japan, in between Shikoku, Kyushu, and Honshu, and it's that nice little body of water to the south of Japan that bleeds into the Pacific Ocean and is entirely uncontested. But the Japan Sea that would become the Pacific Ocean obviously became a different name. And so when the Korean government today says, no, this isn't the name, what's interesting is to look at how that policy itself has shifted. In the last 15 years, the Korean government, the South Korean government at least, has shifted from saying, okay, it has to be called the East Sea, to saying, no, we need a dual name for it. And this is kind of actually politically intriguing, because by requesting a dual name, they're lodging a dispute. And that's useful pedagogically, because you can get people to think about why this name may need to be changed. And names have always changed. There are abundant names on the planet for territories and oceans. And so the South Korean government wants to shift this around. It's a useful device for understanding how colonization works, and it doesn't need to be limited to Korea. That said, if we bring North Korea into the room, it gets even more interesting, because most older Korean maps, 13th, 14th, 15th century, 1500s, name this the Choson, the Choson-hae. So beyond just the East Sea, they give it the name that North Korea today uses for Korea. And so it gets really complicated, because if the South Korean government wants to call it just the East Sea, historically speaking, in Korean terms, it should be called the Sea of Choson, which it is on many European maps in the 1780s, in the 1820s, because that was the name for Korea at the time. And so just to think about how all of this is still unstable has so much to do with how the terms of the peace were settled in the Asia sphere versus the European sphere. I mean, and this is where it does become important to make sort of broad, sweeping, general statements. We don't have, there are very few naming and border contests in Europe today, precisely because of the structure, the architecture of NATO and the European Union, which said, border disputes have to be dismissed before you have member status. There are some, of course. We've got the, Gibraltar and several small border lines still, but those are jointly managed until new names or new agreements can be achieved. And the problem is, because of the way the United States sort of exculpated Japan from guilt of equivalent crimes that Germany had committed. I mean, if we're going, we don't have to use the word National Socialism, but if we're going to talk about crimes against humanity and war crimes, then yeah, Japan ranked up there with Germany. But Japan did not have to forfeit both national capital and national territory the way Germany did. That is to say, Germany got divided. Japan did not get divided. Korea did. And that's a totally historical, bizarre situation, but has everything to do with the fact that the United States used the Treaty of Peace with Japan, i.e. the San Francisco Treaty, not to end the war that had happened, but to set out the terms for the war that was happening, the Cold War. And that's why this is such a mess for Asia today.
You make another very interesting claim in the book at one point, and you speak about this tendency inside Korea to both remember history when it's abroad and forget history when it's domestic. And you speak about the old Seodaeum jail. Now, I've been there myself. It's effectively, I guess for listeners, it's like an Auschwitz-style museum today where you can walk around and see the execution chambers and the torture chambers. And it was set up by the Japanese to imprison and torture, I suppose, mostly political prisoners. And you say it's now a museum to this moment, but Koreans also then forget that as soon as the country changed hands, it was Koreans torturing Koreans themselves. And this is not the history that is remembered as the Japanese history. So it's almost like at least on that side of it, there's this tendency to be very selective in what they remember.
Yeah.
And
absolutely. Sorry. No, absolutely. And that's something that's really been interesting for me to observe at the Sodaemon jail, because since No Mu-hyun's presidency, in particular, beginning in 2003, the exhibits have shifted at the Sodaemon jail. And so, yes, the focus remains, as it should, on how the Japanese built this jail, and this is where many were tortured and imprisoned, and some killed. But different from even 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the prison displays now have a separate wing that show where democracy activists were, South Korean democracy activists in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were imprisoned. And so, this is the last person, I believe this is true, the last person to be executed at the prison was was Park Chung-hee's assassin. So that brings us right up almost to the 1980s, right? And so this prison's history is equally balanced between Japanese occupation era and South Korea's dictatorship era. That is where South Korea is today in many respects, and why you can measure the health of South Korean democracy by the virtue of history wars are within South Korea at the moment. How do we describe Gwangju? How do we describe Park Chung-hee? How do we describe Jeju? And so these things measure the fact that South Korean society is really on the verge of analyzing itself. And that is a very healthy sign. By comparison, you don't hear a lot of similar claims in China about it's time to really nationally re-examine the Cultural Revolution. And so, South Korea's overcoming the dictatorships had a lot to do with efforts to claim what South Koreans had done to South Koreans after Japanese colonization. So using an alien, a foreign entity as a foil is always useful. Again, as an American right now, China and Russia remain the useful outside adversary, North Korea, of course, too, the useful outside adversary around which you can gain domestic national support. And so South Korea for a long time could easily use Japan. I mean, it was illegal under Park Chung-hee to criticize the South Korean government, but it was not illegal to criticize Japan or Japanese colonialism. And so you look at the student placards in the 1965 moment when South Korea is normalizing with Japan, instead of solely criticizing the South Korean government for selling out South Koreans, it's a criticism of Japan asking for too much, because that was legal. But that releases domestic pressure that's sort of like a stopgap or a valve that you can open if you're organizing a society. And so it just, the way these islands fit into it is you displace the nationalist impulses onto an offshore site. So it becomes more of a performance kind of nationalism than anything that could possibly lead to violence. And yet at the same time, you are correct. South Koreans have immolated themselves, both setting fire to themselves, cutting off body parts, and yet I'm not sure what the right word is, but that's a sort of deeply symbolic moment of saying, South Korea, Korea matters. Why can't you pay attention to us? Instead of starting some sort of violence against Japan, right? I mean, yes, the worst thing that a South Korean has done in Japan on so-called Takeshima Day is to take the Japanese national bird and cut its head off. Hasn't shot anybody. Unlike when you get out on the water, in real today terms, the Russian Coast Guard has shot dead a Japanese fisherman for poaching in what is now recognized as Russian territorial water. And that has not happened, thank goodness, between Japan and Korea.
So let's talk about those tensions here. So it may be hard for people to grasp just how tense it can be around these islands, of course. Now, when you get off the ferry at Dokdo, it says there's a sign that says the loss of Dokdo is the loss of Korea. And it seems quite hyperbolic, and especially because you mentioned in 1965 there was this Treaty of Basic Relations which normalized relationships between Japan and Korea. And you mentioned in the book that since then, of course, it's been a very normal relationship in many, many ways. They now even have joint military drills together. So the idea that everything about the interaction, economically, socially, can be very, very normal, very, very straight down the line. They can be as close as you can imagine. But this one issue, this one almost politicization of history, in a sense, really does tear them apart. It's almost like this wedge that won't go away, I suppose.
It's a wedge that won't go away. It's a very good way of putting it. It's also an object with which each side can test relations with the United States. You know, who are you gonna pick, us or them? But what's emerged and evolved over recent years, Dokdo is a Korean space. Korea would say this is Korean territory. When you say it in Korean, Uritang is our land. And you don't have to use the word South Korea or North Korea. So this is a spot against which we can unify vis-a-vis Japan and just say it's our land. And that's why I think it's really interesting that the sort of motto and the song is it's our land. It's not part of it. Yes, when you watch certain Korean news stations, you are the first person on in early morning, and the South Korean national anthem is playing. The sun rises over Dokdo, so it has to be part of Taehanmingguk. And I have not lived in North Korea, so I don't know whether there's similar programming. At the same time, the posters, you get off that ferry, and yes, Dokdo is the first piece of territory Japan stole. But you're not saying North or South Korea, you're saying Japan. And so this has been a very useful thing. So at that, when you earlier mentioned the 2004-2005 moment, things really ratcheted up. It became quite an incident to the extent that the then North Korean government volunteered to send its navy to help defend Dokdo for Korea. And the semiotics of that, as well as the optics of that, were fairly huge. Both South and North Korea respectively issued stamps, postal stamps, for Dokdo. And that's where both could use the same language and say, this is our land. So fast forward to this year, and the really key moment we're in, historically speaking, and which is really difficult as a historian to talk about because I have no idea what's going to happen. But there we are at the Olympics. There's the issue of the Unification Flag. The true Unification Flag includes Dokdo as a spot. But because the International Olympic Committee has a rule about no political acts at the Olympics, South Korea, as hosts of the Winter Olympics, acceded to Japan's demand that the Dokdo spot was removed from the flag that would go into the opening ceremony. The North Koreans got upset about that and waved the true the true Unification Flag. Every time you saw them on TV, at least in the United States, they were waving the flag that had Dokdo on it. So there's now competing unification flags. But then you jump ahead to the totally, earth-shattering moment of April 27th, the Panmunjom Declaration, followed by a lavish dinner, and there's a mango mousse for dessert that everybody looks really excited to eat, and it has Dokdo on the unification flag, which is on top of the frosting. What does the Japanese government do? Does it praise the fact that North and South Korea are having a unification talk? No, it complains that Dokdo is not Korean territory, and therefore that's how the Japanese government contributes to the moment. So this is deeply frustrating because obviously, again, this is something that Koreans can agree on, North and South, which is really difficult to do. And Japan wants to keep being the bad boy in the room on this particular issue, not for any other reason that the current outlook of the current administration of Japan is to try to erase these histories of empire and say, well, this has always been ours, so it will always be ours. Empire had nothing to do with being Japan. And so it's unfortunately an ongoing political program and works very well on all sides, although noticeably, I think it's fair to say that Japanese are increasingly less interested in this. Fewer Japanese politicians showed up at Dokdo Day this year, or Takeshima Day, and so as the Japanese government ramps up how many school textbooks have to include the language of inherency and always and forever Japanese, in general, Japanese people are increasingly showing, lack of concern over this because there are other concerns. There's North Korean missiles. There is a dwindling economy. There's a dwindling population. Real concerns, not a rock that nobody really wants to live on.
So what is a very real concern for Japanese people, though, today is, I suppose, the theme that runs through your book, and it's right there in the title, this issue of apology. And of course, at least on the Japanese side, they make these claims like we've been asked to apologize for things too many times. We've done it before. We've made reparations. And on the Korean side, there's a claim that you haven't done enough, or you haven't been sincere enough, or your language wasn't quite there, or it's been retracted afterwards by other politicians. So I suppose this is, the history that undercuts the big, deep, important undercurrent of Dokdo itself, of just what should happen, just how much this apology should exist. And what would it do? Would it in any way help the issue? I mean, that's the Japanese claim, at least, that it won't.
That is such a good difficult and excellent question, and you phrased it beautifully. I have several ways of answering. The way I want to begin is, I believe the public opinion poll, I believe this is 2015, it may be 2014, the South Korean think tank Asan Institute conducted a very interesting poll asking which problem with Japan concerns you most. I believe the random sampling was about 1,000, even 1,500 people, but Asan does really substantially good polls. And so the participants who crossed age, gender, political affiliation were asked to pick among three issues. Was it comfort women? Was it Japanese school textbooks? Was it Dokdo? Which issue was of major concern? And forgive me if I add incorrectly on your podcast, but what's interesting is the final number. So it is, let me try to get this right. 8% are worried about comfort women, 12% are worried about textbooks, and 80% say it's Dokdo and we just hate Japan. And so that's where recognizing that this really isn't about the rock, but it's about...
Could I throw an element in there from your book just for a second?
Sure.
You mentioned in your book just on that, it's the perfect kind of time to bring this in, that as the victims of the Japanese crimes have died out, you mentioned that the rocks have replaced the victims.
Yes. And I believe that's still true. What's unfortunate in the last 2.5 years or 3 years has been the bringing together of the very few remaining victims and the rocks. So if you go to a Wednesday demonstration at the Comfort Woman statue, for example, the Peace statue in Seoul, it's fairly frequent to see somebody carrying a sign for Dokdo at the Peace statue. And because in recent years, under the Abe administration, the administration of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, he has intentionally conflated these issues to make it all about, sort of dirty Asia, dirty Korea, dirty China. They're playing tricks. And that's different from where we were 15 years ago when it was possible to discuss these issues discreetly. And yes, and that's what's been interesting in my own research, because I thought, okay, so the islands are the place you tell the story, and yet now the islands are the repository of all of the stories. So, if in the worst case scenario, the islands in the East China Sea come to stand in for the Nanjing massacre. And I put it out there that way because that has yet to happen, to the best of my knowledge. But in the instance of Dokdo, because under the Abe administration, there's been so much targeting of Korea in particular, for a host of reasons, but Korea in particular, the conflation of these issues has been put onto play. And it's just, to bring it back to your earlier question about don't Japanese feel put upon, yes. And in 1995, that was absolutely palpable. Numerous colleagues, very popular opinion makers were saying, okay, we're not Germany. Please stop telling us to do what Germany did. And reasons were across the board. People didn't like that often Japanese were described as, well, it's a shame culture, not a guilt culture, and because they're not Christian, they'll never understand. That's sort of a total non-starter, but it was a framing device for a lot of the conversation. Then, it's a fact that Japanese suffered at the end of the war a lot because of American firebombing, including the only use of nuclear weapons against civilian populations. So wait, how do we square that with the crimes we've done? Because we got criminal action on us. So, that was there too. And then that sort of builds, and that was there in 1995. And yet at the same time in 1995, there were quite a substantial number of reconciliation efforts. of not just student groups and faculty groups, but exchanges and government-sponsored issues. So you've got government-sponsored reconciliation X, Y, and Z. You have government-sponsored, music groups, school groups. Jump ahead to 2015, it's as if we're on a different planet because there's backlash. And there's no government-sponsored reconciliation effort. In fact, it's the government sponsoring groups that will target reconciliation efforts. All in the moment saying, oh, I'm upholding the same words, I'm saying the same thing, but my government is actually paying to undermine that. And that's where it's been really deeply frustrating, not simply to Koreans, to Chinese, to Americans who work on this, but mainly to the Japanese scholars themselves who have spent their careers trying to elucidate the inner workings of imperialism. For Japan, they are the ones far more important than me or Korean scholars or Chinese scholars. The Japanese scholars who get branded right now as anti-Japanese because they have demonstrated the history needed for reconciliation efforts. That's the problem. And so today in 2018, different from when I was thinking about this in 2005, for example, today we've got a really divided Japan. And on something like Dokdo, that works to Korea's benefit because no Korean, Dokdo non uri tang입니다, right? Dokdo's ours. We're not giving it up. But Japan doesn't have something like that right now. It has an emperor, but the emperor's about to abdicate. He's a very popular emperor. So right now is a time of real unease in the course of Japan moving forward. And so I think in a lot of these conversations, for those of us who haven't lived through massacres, and correct me, I don't know your family's history, for example, but my family is not part of suffering under Japan. And
no,
so
mine neither.
Okay, so in that respect, it's up to us to say, okay, who in Japan is trying to broaden the conversation rather than narrow it? Because as the perpetrator nation, Japan, the only reason we were able to get to this stage of talking about these histories is because of the efforts of Japanese historians and activists that brought all these issues forward. And the problem is, after they brought them forward, there was a sort of real backlash. And we're living in that right now under the threat of what's going to happen with nuclear North Korea. And so there's all this stuff going on at a time in which I would argue the South Korean government right now is doing an extremely good job of not weaponizing the histories of colonization, right? I mean, there are times in which if you've got nothing else to do as a South Korean president, you can deploy the anti-Japan card, and we are not seeing that. Yes, the comfort women will continue to get the dignity and the recognition they deserve, but I'm not seeing this as, Moon Jae-in trying to shore up his support by bringing out the comfort woman card. He's trying to give them the dignity, but he's also trying to achieve stability in the region and not have that based on the history of colonization. And so this is, the deeply unfortunate part is that the most powerful open society in the region, Japan, which was the perpetrator nation, is doing the opposite. And so, at the height of the Panmunjom moment in April, what is the Japanese government doing? It's insisting that the Philippine government tear down a comfort woman statue. And it's just, this is where it just almost borders on the theatrics of the absurd, because you really want to move forward, and yet the rug keeps getting pulled out from under you. So, was it obviously political to put Dokdo on the dessert topping at the Panmunjom Declaration? Yes, but that's a way of bringing Koreans together. Was it in the region's interest for Japan to officially lodge a state complaint against that dessert? That was sort of absurd.
So it's very important. I suppose as a last question here, we should look towards the future a little bit. So conflict, I suppose, is unlikely unless someone acts incredibly rash in the situation. Then it's also quite unlikely. Yep. And so failing that Trump does something crazy on this situation here, there's also, on the other side of that, there's almost like a theme in international relations that there's sort of a normativity of occupation, that once you've held land for long enough, regardless of other people's claims, it is yours. And of course you see this with Turkish occupations in Cyprus and Israeli occupations and things like this. Once it's yours, it is very hard to actually claim back without other sorts of challenges and international problems. So what is the future here? Because you mentioned it in the book that despite it being a very important part of career Dokdo, that only about 5,000 people ever visit the island each year. They pay quite a large amount of money to go there. The tourism is very low. It's always a slightly older demographic. The young people are just not interested anymore. And you put forward an idea here that perhaps the solution to this would be to make Dokdo a ecological reserve. That it's simply open for international research, not just Japan, not just Korea, but international research altogether. And if any resources just happen to be found, like natural gas or oil or something important and rich underneath, then that money goes towards the research itself, and that would neutralize the issue. So do you still see this as a way forward, or have you lost hope?
No, I haven't. I never lose hope. I'm a historian. I have to have hope. I still think that would be a wonderful idea. I still understand that that's highly unlikely to happen. I personally wish the Singapore summit had happened on Dokdo, because then we could kill two birds with one stone. It would be clear that the United States had created the problem, and then it would be a space of Korean unity. I do think that Dokdo is a place that is essential for North and South to speak. So it would behoove the current moment for the Japanese government to recognize this signal importance. That's probably not going to happen given the current Japanese administration. And also the hardline position in which each of these island contests is now tied to the other. So, but back to the sort of notion of a peace park, if it could be a peace park between North and South Korea, and North and South Korea, separate entities could invite Japan, that would be great. So that maybe in the same way, I think that at the moment it would be really helpful for the United States to open some sort of consular office in Pyongyang. It would be really helpful if Japanese could travel to Dokdo by boat from Japan. Very few Japanese would do this. Very, very few. But those who really wanted to would have the wind taken from their sails if they could sail from Japan rather than having to fly and boat. But then they could go and they could stand on the island, and whether or not they wave a flag is different, but it wouldn't be this airspace, sea space, land space issue, which is entirely fabricated since this issue became an issue in the first place. So the way that people are talking about the 38th parallel, the DMZ, as a peace park, as an ecological zone, that's in a future Korea. I'm not going to say a unified Korea or federated Korea, because I have no idea what's going to happen. But as a Korean space, to make this particular small spot open to the world rather than cordoned off is in everybody's interest. It's a very, there's incredible richness in the sea around it, entirely unexplored deep sea trenches that really are the future for the planet, and nobody really understands them in any true way at the moment. People have taken samples, but this is the kind of thing that Korea could offer to the world. Do they have to assert total sovereignty? Well, that's probably what's going to happen given the history of occupation. But that's where it's in the Japanese government's interest to recognize its position in the region, which is still the third largest economy, still the most powerful open society and still the country that could lead the region if it weren't throwing history around like a weapon.
So, on that note, we might end it there. So, the book we've been speaking about today is called Troubled Apologies Among Japan, Korea, and the United States. You have another book out as well about Korea's about Japanese occupation of Korea, and I believe you have another book pending, do you?
I'm still typing.
Okay.
I'm typing as much as I can, but there are articles. I promise I'm not slacking off.
Not a problem. So everyone else, keep your eyes peeled for that. I will as well. And so, Alexis Dudden, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you so much for including me.